I've got breaking news. Dungeons & Dragons isn't a game. My name is Joe, and you're watching The Philosophy of Game Mastering. I want to talk about something that I just saw from Ben of Questing Beast. He actually just had a video come out a few hours ago talking about something he called TUNIC, which is an acronym that he uses when he is being a game master. What Ben mentions in this video is actually really interesting to me because I'm reading one of Rob Kuntz's newish books. I guess you could call it a book. It's not as long as a book. It's maybe about 50 pages, but it's called The Fourth Category. Anyway, The Fourth Category is a follow-up to Rob Kuntz's other book on Dave Arneson called The Genius of Dave Arneson. Going back to Ben at Questing Beast is he's talking about something called TUNIC. TUNIC is an acronym that stands for Time Until Next Impactful Choice. So in his video, Ben is arguing that games like Dungeons & Dragons and most role-playing games really aren't about role-playing at all. And I actually believe that. Now, there are role-playing elements for sure, but you could have a table of 5 or 6 players who don't do any role-playing at all. And you could have a mixture. You could have someone who's very into role-playing. They may even dress up, wear a cloak, fancy pointy hat, whatever they want. But Dungeons & Dragons isn't just about role-playing. Again, just one aspect. So I do agree with Ben in that sense. Ben also mentions how games such as Dungeons & Dragons and other TTRPGs are about opened and closed systems. An open system is one where you have an infinite amount of choices. A closed system, if you take Monopoly as a board game, it's a very closed system. It's repetitive. You're going around a board. However, Monopoly being a very closed system and something like Dungeons & Dragons being a very open system is what he's trying to contrast there. And I agree with him there. And in fact, in Rob Kuntz's The Fourth Category, he specifically mentions open and closed game systems and says he's done a lot of research on systems theory. Chapter 1, Understanding Conceptual Systems. This is from The Fourth Category by Robert J. Kuntz. He says, the very idea imparted by the phrase that we play in, quotes, an adventure, as opposed to playing a board game wherein we just play it, quotes, separates the two forms as distinct concepts unrelated to each other. And Ben does mention this play-in aspect of Dungeons & Dragons and other RPGs. Going back to the title of Rob's book, The Fourth Category, where did he get that? Where does that come from? In it, he states that during an early playtest of Dungeons & Dragons, most likely the playtest or the first draft that's also printed in the new book by Wizards of the Coast called The Making of Original Dungeons & Dragons, 1970 to 1977. There is a early, I believe, 1973 first draft of OD&D that Gary wrote, and that's the playtest that Rob, who was there for that playtest, mentions. You can hear some of this on the Dungeon Delvers. About 6 months ago, the Dungeon Delver Bill interviewed Rob Kuntz over the phone. It's about 3 hours long, and it's great to watch. You should watch that. I'll put a link down in the description. But anyway, Rob Kuntz himself was at this original playtest before 1974, before the original white box came out, before Dungeons & Dragons was even published. And one of the things that Rob had said was that after the session, Gary Gygax was just looking kind of indiscriminately at a part of the table, just kind of staring off into space, kind of like thinking. And he started to talk about what the game meant to him. And he said, Gary Gygax said, I think we've just created a fourth category of game. And then Gary went on to describe what he thought were the 3 categories of games. And the first of those is, of course, war games. So Gary says one of the first categories of games is war games. The second category of games that Gary mentions is parlor games. So things like charades, maybe even like you consider Pictionary, things like that would be a parlor game. Maybe even poker, right? Card games. And then third category, according to Gary Gygax, is sort of outdoor games, like play games, like kids playing tag or even baseball, football, things like that, outdoor activity games. So Ben of Questing Beast says that he doesn't believe Dungeons and Dragons and other OSR games or any role-playing game really is about role-playing. I agree with him there. I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I believe that Dungeons and Dragons isn't even a game.
What?
And what I mean by that is that it's so outside of the realm of what Gary Gygax thought were games in general. And it was also something that Rob Kuntz had mentioned after the playtest happened. They were basically silent. They had nothing to compare it to, right? You could not compare a playtest of original Dungeons and Dragons before it even came out. I can't even imagine what it was like. But when Gary Gygax DM'd that session, that playtest session, Rob Kuntz specifically said no one said anything because they had no commentary. How do you comment on something you've never experienced before? It'd be like watching a movie, the very first movie that ever came out. You're in the theater. How do you compare that? There's no other movie to compare it to. And so I'm arguing that Dungeons and Dragons is not about role-playing specifically, and it's not about gaming. If you look at the definition of a game, a form of play or sport, especially a competitive one, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck. Typically in most games, you have winners and losers. Even in cooperative games like Forbidden Island, you the players, are playing against the game. The idea is that the island is sinking and you need to collect certain treasure, a number of treasures using cards going around the board before the island sinks. So you are playing against time, which is basically playing against the game. So it's a cooperative game because the players are playing on one side. And you could say it is a competitive game because you're playing, one set of players versus the game. And there is going to be a clear winner or loser when the game ends. Well, Dungeons and Dragons is infinite. It doesn't end. Dungeons and Dragons has open and closed aspects. It's not a fully open system. I would say that 90% of it is open and 10% of it is closed. At least that's what original D&D was. It was more about using your imagination and telling a story cooperatively with the referee or the game master, the DM. Now, what Rob Kuntz says in the fourth category, I'm gonna read what he's describing as open and closed. Classic D&D is a merger of conceptual and mechanical systems, generally noted as open and closed, respectively. The mechanics often come into focus when there is a need to ascertain the probabilities for success of a player's interactions within the fantastic surround. Now, what Rob is saying here is that Dungeons and Dragons, or at least OD&D, was really an open system about imagination. Imagine that you're in a flow state, right? You've got the game master dictating what's happening. You've got role-playing happening. You even have combat happening. However, when it becomes a closed system, or when the focus zooms in, is when you need to make a dice roll. So you need to bring chance into the game, because if you don't, then it's basically game master versus player. By introducing the aspect of the dice and a chance that something may happen or not, succeed or fail, isn't up to the game master or the players. It's stating that we don't know the outcome, so we need to decide it. The dice will decide the outcome. This open and closed aspect to RPGs gives it a hidden and an obvious balancing. And what I mean by this is when you're immersed in the game world, the mechanics are hidden. You're not really worried about picking up your 20-sided die to see if you crit the ogre. You're actually role-playing. You're immersed in it. So it's when the mechanics infiltrate that flow, that open-endedness, it becomes a more closed system. And what it does is your zoomed out state is sort of the one of flow, right? You can see everything, you're flowing through it. However, when the DM says, okay, Joe, make a 2-hit roll, that's when things get focused in, right? And that focus comes from the fact that you need to see the mechanics. The mechanics become obvious at that point. It's the same thing in, OD&D was really like more of a narrative. It was less concrete in a lot of ways. It was more flowing, meaning you didn't always have to roll to search a room. You would just tell the dungeon master you search the room. And I think Dungeons and Dragons over time, as skills moved in, I think towards late second edition and then obviously third edition, where you have feats and skills, the open system started to close in on itself. It became more constrictive, and it became more mechanical. And I see that people are moving towards OSR, or have been moving towards OSR for the last several years, because they prefer that open system. In fact, Rob Kuntz, again, separately has said original D&D players didn't have a lot of material, and it was more creative and imaginative. So they had to actually get out their graph paper and their hex paper, and they had to figure out what their world was like. They couldn't just take a world off the shelf. It was very creative, and that is a huge part of what I believe Dungeons and Dragons is and was. I think we need to make that come back more. I think we need to have, or it would be good to have, more creativity on the dungeon master side. And there are a lot of dungeon masters who are creative, and I'm not saying they're not, but it is really a lazy way to do it. I'm just going to go buy, Curse of Strahd and start from the beginning and take the characters all the way to the end. That's really not what you should do with that book. That book is really more, in my mind, a source book, where you can pick and choose what you want, put it into your game world, and if the characters encounter it, great. If not, nothing lost, because you're literally just pulling it from a book, right? You didn't spend hours writing out, the monsters and the descriptions. It's all there. Use it as a resource. That's my take on the open and closed aspects of Dungeons and Dragons, and also why I'm going to name it a non-game. I'm going to call it really not the fourth category of game like Rob does, because to me, it's not a game. What I would like to start calling Dungeons and Dragons, and this is going to be completely bizarre to many of you, but I'm calling it the first imagination engine. And what I mean by that is Dungeons and Dragons absolutely requires the players to use their imagination. The game master themselves has to be imaginative to come up with a story and interesting characters and locales for the adventurers to find and explore. So really, Dungeons and Dragons isn't a fourth category of game, and I don't mean to disagree with you, Rob, because I highly respect your writing in this and all the other stuff you've done through the past. So yes, we could call it a fourth category of game, but if Dungeons and Dragons turns out to not really be a game, it becomes an imagination engine, and you can do almost anything with it. And one of the other reasons why I'm calling Dungeons and Dragons a non-game and calling it an imagination engine is because there really just sets a guidelines, right? And if you look at original TSR, before it was called TSR, was Tactical Studies Rules. And when TSR was formed, or when Tactical Studies Rules was formed, it wasn't meant to be a game publisher. It was meant to be a publisher of rules, which is why they were called Tactical Studies Rules. They weren't printing actual end-to-end games. They were rules that you could take and then make your own, which is why D&D is so infinite and wonderful, is that whoever picks up the rules, it becomes theirs immediately.
Fellas, it looks like we're facing a knot yug. Here's the plan.
You don't have to follow them verbatim. In fact, you could just follow one of the rules and throw everything else out. Everything else comes from your imagination. The more imagination you put into the rules makes it more your game. When Gary Gygax wrote the first draft of Dungeons and Dragons in 1973, and you can read it in that book, The Making of, he specifically mentions other items, other rule sets that you need, right? He actually mentions chainmail, the fantasy supplement of chainmail, and chainmail itself for combat rules. He also mentions the Avalon Hill game outdoor survival for basically what are outdoor rules. When he assembled the first draft of Dungeons & Dragons, the original draft, he was seen more as a curator of the game. Yes, he was a game developer, he was a creator and a writer, but he used other aspects of other games. I mean, even Chainmail that he worked on with Jeff Perrin came from other wargaming rules and wargaming systems. So when Gygax met Arneson and he saw what Arneson had come up with, the actual role-playing aspects of it, the actual becoming a character in a war game and being a single unit as opposed to a group of units, that was very unique. And that's what also Gary Gygax incorporated into the rule set. So Gary Gygax was a remixer. He was gathering things and remixing them. And if you look at what Dave Arneson did, it was a lot more unique in some ways. And now I'm not dissing on Gygax and I'm not elevating Arneson. I think both of those men were required, plus a lot of other people in the industry around them, the playtesters. There were a lot of other people involved in Dungeons & Dragons, in the making of Dungeons & Dragons. It's what Brian Eno calls the Scenius, as opposed to a genius.
I think although great new ideas are usually articulated by individuals, they're nearly always generated by communities. All these people who are called genius actually sat in the middle of something that I call Scenius, Scenius. So just as genius is the creative intelligence of an individual, Scenius is the creative intelligence of a community.
The thing you don't see behind the genius is everything that inspired them from the day they're born until the day they're dubbed a genius. There you have it. I hope you liked that video. Before you go, I want to let you know that I'm having a giveaway, a 1,000 subscriber giveaway. My channel is currently at about 914 subscribers. When I hit 1,000 subscribers, I'm giving away some free stuff. So please check out demogorgon.com and it'll take you to the official entry form. And then read the official entry rules because there's 4 other ways that you could win. Check it out. TUNIC is an acronym that stands for TUNIC is an acronym that stands for Time Until Next Impactful Choice.